we are at the last panel of the day. Where does the story go from here? We're going to sort of open the conversation to new perspectives, new directions. Where does the story go from here locally for Newtown, the Danbury area, Connecticut? Where does the story go from here for the nation? Where does the story go from here for reporters? How do we think about individuals and families and communities? Where should we be looking as journalists? What kind of choices should we be making for ourselves? Wide open panel. We also, as has already come up a few times, have now overlaid on Sandy Hook another crisis, that in Boston, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So, just to introduce everybody briefly, I'm not going to take too much time, I want to maximize the time for discussion. My immediate right is Dave Cullen. We have a covey of Cullens here today. Two Cullens. My immediate right is Dave Cullen, who's the author of Columbine, the New York Times bestseller, which reflected a decade's worth of reporting into the background and aftermath of the Columbine school shootings, and won more awards than I care to say. I will say that Dave Cullen is a Dart Center Ochberg Fellow, of whom there have been several today, as is Beth Macy from the Roanoke Times. I think I first met Beth in the aftermath of Virginia Tech shootings, which she covered for that paper, and is going to bring some thoughts on what the long-term picture looks like and long-term trajectory from that. She's the family's beat reporter at the Roanoke Times, where she's worked since 1989. Casey Medal, Columbia University Race Reporting Prize, and she was a 2010 fellow in journalism at Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. She also now is working on a book, which when it comes out, you just all have to buy. Candice Kane, next to her, JD, PhD, imposing letters after her name. Candice is the Chief Operating Officer of Cure Violence, public health initiative in Chicago that supports community-based and citywide violence prevention. If you saw the film The Interrupters, you saw the fruits of Cure Violence's labor on the streets of Chicago, aiming to reduce the incidence of gun violence and all of the public health catastrophes that follow from that. Next to her, my New Haven neighbor, Dr. Stephen Marans, a child and adult psychoanalyst who is the Harris Professor of Child and Family Traumatic Harris Professor of Child Psychiatry and Professor of Psychiatry at the Child Study Center in the Department of Psychiatry at Yale. He's the director of the National Center for Children Exposed to Violence and founder of the Child Development Community Policing Program, which I first became aware of when it was the Child Witness to Violence Project, yeah?
No.
No? Ah, okay. Well,
that's all right.
Founder of the Child Development Community Policing Program, a pioneering collaboration between mental health and law enforcement professionals, providing collaborative response to children and families exposed to violence and trauma that occurs in their homes, neighborhood, and schools. Next to Stephen is the other Cullen, is Kevin Cullen, columnist for the Boston Globe. He's been a reporter at the Globe since 1985 on pretty much every beat you can imagine. Cops reporter, legal affairs correspondent, foreign correspondent. He's really here for a couple of reasons. The proximate reason, obviously, is the events in Boston in the last few days. In a sense, it brings us full circle. But Kevin and I have also spent a lot of time talking about another series of traumatic events. He covered the conflict in Northern Ireland and has a particular sense of how tragedy can play out in the long run. And finally, last but by no means least, and really bringing the story home in a sense, is Jacqueline R. Smith, the managing editor of the News-Times of Danbury, the major daily paper in the town immediately adjacent to Newtown. She's been a reporter at the Current, the Day of New London, the New Haven Register, the Meriden Record Journal, where she was also city editor and assistant managing editor. She too has a big pile of awards, and she teaches journalism at, or has taught at University of Hartford and Southern Connecticut State University. And actually, Jacqueline, I think I'm going to begin with you, because this is your story. This is your local story, and your paper, from the first moments that the word came out, has had to make sort of strategic choices about where to go from here. That's what you've been asking every day pretty much since December 14th. Where do you see the story going in Newtown and Danbury and for your reporters over the next few months? Where do you think we're going?
If I could respond this way, and thanks for giving me the chance to do that. You remember this morning Lieutenant Vance was talking about the need for police to corral journalists, keep us all together. Well, that's not our role. That's not how we do our job. And I want to remind everyone that when we report that way, then we're in a situation where we're waiting every 90 minutes to get a feed from police. We're not going to get all the truth that way. We're just going to get the official statements. And so, I directed my reporters, somebody would go to the press conference, but don't just wait for that information. You have to get out there and talk to people and piece together the story. And sure, initially there were many items that were not correct, but I also want to remind budding journalists here that you keep pursuing anyway, because initially even the police were getting details wrong. We saw that when the affidavits came out, they were sealed and they came out 2 weeks ago. There were some items, like the police initially thought Adam Lanza was a teenager and he wasn't. Things in the long run didn't make a big difference, but as you report, as the story develops and you move along, you get closer and closer to the truth. Truth, though, is elusive, and when you ask where are we going, we will keep reporting the story on many levels, and it comes down to people coping with an unthinkable tragedy, and we have to help the community do that too. And we do it not just with the surface level stories, how to disperse the millions of dollars that have come in, and all the thousands of teddy bears too, but also, how does the community redefine itself? You hear people in Newtown saying we don't want to be known as the Sandy Hook tragedy people. We are Newtown. We are strong. So the role of the paper is to help that and to keep informing, keep pushing and prodding the investigative part of the story as well as the human part of the story.
And as you look at your sort of editorial calendar, thinking forward for the next 6 months or a year, what do you think, not that we can always know, but what are you looking at as kind of the major markers? Where should we be paying attention to things likely to come up over the next period of time?
In June, we expect that the investigative report will be coming out. The investigators have said that they think it would be June, and so we'll be pushing and hoping that happens. We would hope with that, as Elaine mentioned earlier, to be getting information about the journals that Adam Lanza kept. There were 7 of them brought out of the house, and maybe something would be revealed in the writing there. So that would be one of the first things. There's always anniversary stories, but we don't really like that as a hook, but I think people in the community expect it too.
Beth, let me turn to you, because your paper was in a very analogous position in Roanoke, right next to Blacksburg, the major responsibility for being the local voice. Talk a little bit about where you saw the story going for the paper, for the staff as reporters, and the role the paper played in the months and years after that. Talk a little bit about
I can relate to a lot to what she's saying, because here we felt this was literally in our backyard, and there were, I think, 500 satellite trucks, and it was probably a little bit better than what you all experienced, because I understand there was really just 1 or 2 roads, and everybody was really close together, and Virginia Tech is a big campus, and also the families were all over Virginia and elsewhere, so there were lots of locales to go out to, maybe a bit more breathing room, but other than that, the experience seems very, very eerily similar. Just a little bit about me. I was I'm not a news reporter. I have always been a feature writer for my 26 or so years in this, and believe it or not, I'd never had to call a grieving family on the phone. People don't believe that, but I'd never had to do it. So the day after I came in, and my editor gave me 2 names, and I had to do the next day. They had just released the names. I had to do that story. And I actually thought, if I quit, I won't have to do this. And I said to my friend, who has done a lot of these kinds of stories, I took him over to the corner, and I said, John, what do I do? He goes, call them up, tell them you're sorry, and see if they want to talk. And by that point, everybody was calling. I mean, the victim, the family that I got most attached to was a family in this community that we cover called Narrows, and it's a very rural, small town, 2,000 people. And the community, as the press came in, and they found Narrows, and they found Tracy Lane's house, and they were parked up in front of her house like train cars, and that community just embraced her, and they told the reporters to go away. And I remember one of them, I found out later, one of the men in our church went over and said to a Chicago Tribune reporter, I know you think you're from a tough town and all, but if you go messing with Tracy Lane, you're going to see what a tough town is. And so that's kind of what we were up against. Oprah personally was calling these families. And and I wrote the story that I could get, and I've been there a long time. I always say the bad thing about being in one place for a long time and being a reporter is, you can't go out and get half and half in your pajamas in the morning. But when something like this happens, somebody who knows somebody. So that's what we did. We just triangulated. I had a friend who happened to know the principal of this high school, and it turned out, okay, the family didn't want to talk, but they were getting ready for his funeral at his high school. He had been the valedictorian. He had lettered in 4 sports. He was the light of the town. He had just gotten a full scholarship for graduate school, and he had just, testified in his church that Sunday, the day before. And so the media, I just happened to find out from a friend of a friend that that's what they were doing. So I got the story I could get at every journey along the way. About 3 weeks later, I wrote a story about the engineering department and how they were trying to do final grades when 8 of the professors had been killed, and the graduate students, and 8 professors and graduate students, and numerous of the students, and how were they going to do the grades? And by then they were willing to talk to me. So I just tried to go to every level to get them to talk when they were ready, and not to hound them when they said not to hound them. Our editor sent a great note, and I know you're the same kind of editor. This was maybe the 3rd or 4th day, and I don't think anybody had slept. She wrote a note saying, I know all these trucks are here, and everybody's pressuring you all, but I just want you to remember they're going to leave, and we're going to still be here. And people won't remember if we got the facts first. They'll remember the way we treated them. And that was really a remarkable statement at the time, and it meant a lot. She brought massage therapists in. We were, maybe a week later, we were encouraged to talk to counselors, which I think some people did. I was talking to a friend of mine last night who lives here and is a CNN reporter, and he was covering all of this with me and kind of going through the same kind of stuff. And he's now covered Sandy Hook, and he covered Superstorm Sandy, and he gets in very deep with his subjects. And one of the things he said that he tells people when he's trying to get them to be interviewed in the immediate aftermath is that when they see not the best case stories happening, like sticking a microphone in a family that clearly doesn't want to talk, he said, they actually had to call the police reporter over, and then they didn't want to talk to anybody. And he actually said to them, I'm not a media entity, I'm a person. And I thought that was he was just very direct. I've covered this kind of thing before. But I guess my advice going forward is to get the story you can. And then also, I did want to talk a little bit about self-care, which came up a bit in the last session. And I think it was helpful that each of the families, like they didn't have to deal with, they had to deal with all the media coming in, but our editors, because we had assigned families, it helped a lot that you just had to deal with one person from our news organization, and that seemed to help. I think some of the advice, I think from some folks from your paper called and gave us just kind of advice looking ahead. We got support, we got care packages in the mail from the people who would cover the Oklahoma City bombing. We had somebody from your paper just called and said, here's what you should do, here's what you should not do. That meant a lot to people. But in terms of self-care, Avelio, my friend at CNN, was saying as he drove back to Newtown, he arrived here at 2 a.m. and he had a story to file the next day at 4, and he had to download his footage. And he said he hadn't slept in 3 days. And he said he got a ticket for the train to D.C. so he could work on his story with his favorite person, his sister. He had to be with somebody who understood him, and he had to be where he was safe. And I thought that was just really great advice. So I guess if I could talk to the reporters who are covering this and looking forward, I would say take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Talk to your editor. Find the editor who will take your 11 p.m. email and respond to you by 11:30, and find the people who have done this kind of work before and really reach out to them.
What kinds of stories as you got past that breaking news phase and ended up at the 6-month phase and toward anniversaries and so on, what kinds of stories seem to resonate for the community? What kinds of choices did the paper make?
Well, we had different teams. We had our Mike Gangloff was covering the mental health in the state. We had somebody in Richmond covering what was going on there with the gun show loophole. It was fairly well organized. A story I did maybe 6 months later, I did a profile of Nikki Giovanni, who was the poet who became sort of the spokesman for the university. She did that great We Are Virginia Tech that was a really healing moment. It was the day after the shootings, I believe. And she hadn't been willing to talk at the time, but 6 months later she was willing to basically say everything, including the controversial part of her story. She had been the shooter's teacher, and she had been the one that wanted him kicked out of her classroom because the other students were really uncomfortable with some of the things he was writing. And, so going back later, maybe somebody doesn't want to talk to you in the first 3-4 months, but, go back maybe 6 months later. And so she'll recount to me what it's like when she's kind of, this radical poet. And the administration was very nervous that she would be speaking and sitting next to President George Bush. And she kept saying to herself, don't punk the president, don't punk the president. So, those are the kinds of things people don't feel free to share with you. And I think also, too, people who say no, people change their minds. So go back later and see, with respect.
All right. And we can come back to lessons from Virginia Tech. Stephen, you've been looking for years now at families and communities in the aftermath of violence, and you were supportive behind the scenes in Newtown as well. Where do you think journalists... What are the stories that are going to be important to be told in this next phase? Either to fill in what's been missed and gotten wrong, but even more so to put stuff on the agenda that should be there.
Well, the perspective I guess I bring is working directly with families and communities, not just Newtown directly, but New Haven and other locations around the country post 9/11 with colleagues in New York City, post Katrina and Hurricane Rita. Our team has been involved with lots of awful events. And I was thinking when I first went to Newtown on the Friday evening that I felt like I was having a bit of deja vu because it reminded me of going to Jonesboro in the early 90s with the multiple satellite vans, et cetera. And as I've been listening today, I've been thinking about what is it that's so particular? Why are we even having this meeting? I mean, I think there are obvious reasons, but they're enormously informative, and it's some of what we've learned over the years. I guess one way of thinking about next steps forward is thinking about why this is such a special topic for all of us, not just as journalists or mental health providers, but as human beings. And I think there's something about going to, not overusing the word trauma, but using it as an anchor point. Because we really define trauma from a clinical point of view, from a human functioning point of view, as a traumatic event is one that's unanticipated, overwhelming, and dangerous, leaving us feeling helpless and out of control. So much so that the event and that experience changes the way we think, the way our brains operate. And it's one of the reasons why there are so many normal symptoms that follow. And if we use that as an anchor, then maybe we can think about the ways in which, as a country, when we are hit by something that is so unanticipated, so uncontrollable, so unavoidable, and leaves us all feeling so terrified and helpless, why it is that we have such a difficult time, and how our responses are a reflection of what we share. So the challenge is, it seems to me, is something of a tension on two levels. One is knowledge, we hope, is a tool for mastering, right? But what happens when we don't have knowledge and we don't have information because it's not available to allow us to master? It came up in the earlier panel when we were talking about red flags. We go to red flags, we go to diagnoses, and by the way, it's not just the questions the media asks, it's the answers that professionals give when they don't have data, but they're willing to give diagnoses and speculate, which I actually find enormously dangerous. But why are people doing that? Because if we have an answer, then we can undo the very nature of our helplessness and the very terror of being so out of control. But does it help us? And I would suggest the answer is no. That what it actually does is allow us to sidestep, or help us to try to sidestep, what we're all dealing with and sharing, because we're human beings, which is the awfulness of what has occurred and the awfulness of our helplessness. So I do think that media plays an enormously important role and will continue to play a role, which is we don't talk. We have a policy at Yale in terms of our trauma work. We don't talk to journalists about the specific work we do in the community in which we're operating, in the same way that as a psychoanalyst I would never talk to a journalist about a patient with whom I'm working. But what we did do, and we did a lot of interviews post-Newtown, as we've done in the past, is when journalists are asking, how do you help parents, how do you help adults think through, anticipate, and take care of themselves? How do they support each other? How does a community come together? I think this has been just such an incredibly important and useful role that the media has played, not just post-Newtown, but in any event that we've been involved. Where I think the tension is that there's something of a live wire effect. That is, that we are drawn, compelled to search for answers that help us feel better, not consciously, but aimed to get us grounded in ways that can't be achieved. And so for those people who sit glued to their televisions for days at end and are symptomatic, we tell them, turn your television off. The stimulation is not fulfilling the mastery function. It's actually re-arousing the very circuits in our brains that keep us feeling agitated and vulnerable and keep us isolated from each other. So at one level, there's a challenge about what is it that we're looking for, while also wanting to provide as much information as is available. But here's the other tension. What about the community itself? And what are the needs of the broader community, the country, and what's the impact of those needs being fulfilled on the community that is the most direct victim? And I'm not just talking about the families that lost loved ones, but the families of children who witnessed the carnage. What's the impact if we know, for example, that two of the most powerful predictors for recovery are identification, 3, social supports, and return to normal routines, and that the absence of those will actually increase the level of symptomatology and predict the failure of recovery? How do we square that with the media presence that was in Newtown or anywhere else for the length of time and the level of disruption that occurred? I'm not suggesting I have an answer, but I am suggesting it poses a problem. And to your wonderful vignette about the assignment to interview a grieving family, it's the easy ones when we see reporters sticking cameras in victims' faces, but that one's a tougher one. And I was delighted to hear your solution.
Quitting?
Because being able to talk about what you knew about this extraordinary young man allowed you to sleep at night. And the idea is, why is it that at that moment do we need to be asking a grieving family to tell us how they're feeling? I don't think we need to be critical of ourselves, because actually there are good reasons why we want to know and why these events stir up so much. Because these are the events that there, but by the grace of God go thee, is the terror that's struck in all of us. And lastly, the problem, and the reason I raised the question earlier, is wouldn't it be a silver lining or a potential growth curve if what could come out of a tragedy like this is that we pay attention, really pay attention, as a country, as journalists, as people from all walks of life, to the children and families and individuals who are affected by violence in this country every single day, even if they don't look like us, don't live in the neighborhoods that we'd want to live in, or talk or walk, etc. So these are the real opportunities, and they're also the opportunities to no longer just be helpless, but to then turn our attention to the fact that we have solutions to, as Jim was pointing out, the majority of the types of violence that affect the greatest number of people every day.
Thank you. And we may circle back and press you for some specifics on imagining what stories like that might look like. Candice, this is a good bridge to you, though. I mean, Cure Violence does believe in intervention and action, and you've been watching not only Newtown but the national gun debate play out and all this sort of thing. What have you been thinking, not only about where the Newtown story needs to go, but where the narrative momentum of this should go? If news organizations, if individual journalists are looking to seize on this moment and help tell some stories that need to be told, what are they?
Well, thanks, Bruce. Actually, we don't work in the environment that has been discussed today. And I've been sitting here thinking, we're a bit of a fish out of water. And yet we work in the environment that Steve just alluded to and that Jim McMillan talked about earlier. We work in those neighborhoods that are impacted every day. We had more than 500 killings last year in Chicago. Now, if a killing involved a child, it was big news. And when we got into big numbers, we became big news. But, you know, I can't tell you how many times someone is shot or killed and there's no news, because it's just what happens every day in so many of our neighborhoods. So we look at violence as a learned behavior, something that's reinforced by peer expectations and then is not kept in check by the social norms of the community where it's occurring. We take a public health approach to it. We look at, you know, those people who are most closely associated with the violence and try to identify, intervene with them, change the way they think, change the way they behave. We also look at events that lead to violence, and we want to interrupt those and, again, change those norms and those expectations of the community that make it okay for those things to happen. You know, it's a bit different, and yet I guess if we, unfortunately, we've had enough of these incidents of, you know, in Sandy Hook and in Virginia Tech, start looking, like maybe there are some things where we can be looking for common elements there as well, so that we can anticipate and intervene and do some things that would stop, you know, these from happening. But right now, in cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New Orleans, Oakland, where we're active, New York City, we're active in neighborhoods here. We do know that there are things that we can do. We can work with the people most closely associated with the problem, hiring people. If you saw the interrupters, which is also on Frontline, you hire people who often used to be the problem themselves. They're credible with the folks that are right at the center of the storm, folks that, you know, really no one else can reach. And then we apply motivational interviewing off of cognitive restructuring techniques, conflict mediation. There's a whole set of things that we train people to do. Very intensive training, a lot of accountability put in place, a lot of data collection. We've been very fortunate to have multiple evaluations now in New York, Chicago, and Baltimore, showing that we add value to the work that law enforcement's already doing. This is not a substitute for law enforcement. We try to get to people before they kind of cross that line. Should be held accountable for their behavior once they do cross the line. And we're having good success. So, you know, it's when I look at the press and I think, well, what can the media do to help with programs like ours? We can tell our story, let people know that there's another way of looking at this issue. And we're not the only ones using a public health approach. I mean, this is really, it's across the country now. LA, a lot of cities have embraced it. A lot of really very progressive police chiefs have really endorsed this approach as well. And I would say that, you know, you talk about going back and correcting. It's interesting that, you know, I'm sitting with, I think, a room full of responsible journalists, but we've been impacted by what I would consider to be not so responsible journalists, because they put the first fact out and they don't do fact checking and they don't go back and they don't correct. And when you're telling a story of a program like ours, it's really important to get it right. And if you don't get it right, then take responsibility for it, you know. So,
talk a little bit about how embracing a public health understanding of gun violence has shaped the work that you do. What does that really mean? It's easy to throw that around. What does that really mean?
Well, we do look at this as an epidemic, violence as an epidemic, something that behaves like an epidemic. So it clusters in neighborhoods. You know, if you look at all of your crime data, hotspots, you know, clusters, just like epidemics would cluster, and it spreads. It starts and then becomes infectious. Well, that's when we talk about it's learned. It's obviously not something, I don't touch Steve and he becomes violent if I'm violent. But, you know, it's learned and it's picked up, because if this is the way people behave in your neighborhood, if this is what you see in your family, if you yourself have been the victim in your neighborhood, and trauma, you talk about trauma, you know, it's not just the people that we work with, it's the participants in the program, it's our workers as well. You talk about care. You know, everybody has to be very vigilant to make sure that we have a system of care for all the folks that we work with. And it's something, I hate to say it, but we were a little late to the game with that. You know, we've only more recently been paying a lot more attention to the needs of our workers, because not only are they traumatized as a result of the work they're doing, but the history that they bring to the job that makes them so successful at the work. So you really have to be careful. And you know, this isn't work that you do in perpetuity. So it spreads, it can be contained then in the same way. Which is why we talk about interrupting transmission, helping people to think differently, learn different ways of responding. You know, most of the violence that we see that leads to, unfortunately, it leads to shootings and often killings in Chicago and in these other cities where we're working. It's not about gangs necessarily. It's about poor impulse control, poor decision making, you know, a lack of opportunities, not thinking, about the brain not having fully developed, you know, and sensation seeking sort of kicking in, fight or flight. I mean, just all these things you can talk more eloquently about than I can. But all this stuff comes into play. We look at someone, they look tough, they think they're tough, but they're really not so tough, and they're not so right-thinking. And we need to help them to figure out other ways of coping.
Okay. Dave, you reported on Columbine as a breaking story, and then spent the next decade walking the cat backwards and re-reporting the story. You've now been watching this play out for the last couple of months, and indeed Boston in the last few days. What have you been thinking as you've been listening today, and as you've watched the events, the remarkable events of the last few months? What's on your mind?
Well, two big things right at the moment. One, because I always like to start with an argument, but I don't understand. Is it Steve? Mm-hmm. I don't understand the idea that it doesn't help, if I understood you right, to understand why. Or did you just mean the victims? It doesn't help to understand, to answer the question why.
No, I was trying to, number one, the fact is that, and I think we saw this recently with Newtown, that one of the things that was happening in the first few days, as was pointed out earlier, was that there was a search for a diagnosis.
Right.
And actually there was quite destructive to those people who had children with Asperger's, because this was the diagnosis that was being touted. But I think we continue to seek a diagnostic reason, a clear set reason of motivation, in part, and I'm not suggesting we shouldn't be intrigued by it. It is intriguing and it is fascinating because it is so, fortunately, unusual. Mass murder is unusual, and it grabs our attention. We want to understand. What I'm suggesting is that there is a difference between trying to understand and driving to understand as though it will fulfill our wish to be able to predict and therefore prevent.
Okay.
So that's the distinction I was trying to make.
Okay. I kind of didn't mean to pick on you, but or even
I didn't feel picked on.
Okay, good.
I like debates.
I don't. But I was thinking from the earlier panel too, and I get this, oddly enough, I get it mostly from psychiatrists and psychologists of a pushback of some of what I do, of not wanting to diagnose or try to to label with these people as either depressives or whatever they might be, psychopaths. One of the NBC News analysts is always sort of railing against that. And I think it is really useful. I think we have to be very careful in just slapping a diagnosis on, especially doing it too early and irresponsibly. Of course, if we get it wrong, then it's idiotic. But also, if we just say, oh, the person is depressive, and so that's why he did it. Well, that's not much of an answer. But I do think it's usually part of the answer. And if we're going to understand someone, it really plays a big factor. And the two people that I followed for the last 14 years and 2 days. One of them was deeply suicidally depressive, and that totally played a role in the fact that he was apparently gradually brought into the sort of the orbit of a psychopath who was very sort of had one mindset, who was sort of diabolical and planning to do this horrible thing, and I think the sort of the susceptibility, the dependability, and the mindset of the deeply depressive person, that played a huge role in it. And to understand how he could have done it, I don't think you can understand Dylan Klebold without understanding his whole mental state. And I think, as long as we do sort of like a rich diagnosis and look into them, I think that's one of the most important things that we can do. And I also think to understand these in mass, that's the only way to go about it. And I've been sort of like surprised in my work to discover from talking to hostage negotiators and a lot of forensic psychologists that most of the school shooters or most of the mass shooters tend to be deeply depressed and suicidally depressed. And when people ask me the big lesson of Columbine, I feel now that the big main unlearned lesson is we haven't addressed depression. And we shouldn't be treating. We should be treating depression because it's a horrible thing. But also, there's a huge motivation or public drive after these events to do something. And if we can channel that into something useful, which happens to be relevant, great. And, the
Right, and
that
that's the
6%
spurious.
are
That's the
undiagnosed
last part is the spurious correlation.
Okay.
And all I was suggesting is, look, I think it's intriguing, and I think your work is intriguing, and I think wanting to know details about something that is so horrific is part of the live wire phenomena. We want to try to master by understanding. I don't have a problem with that. I'm very cautious, and I wish more of my colleagues were more cautious about the level of speculation. But I also think that you said two separate things.
Okay.
We have a problem in this country because we do not designate the level of resources to the people who need resources across multiple areas of difficulty that are well identified, and when they are not identified and then ignored, or they're identified and ignored, then there are lots of problems that ensue. The problem I have is with, and many of my colleagues have, a problem with the idea of suggesting that the dynamic you were just describing is necessarily generalizable and therefore should be the motivation, the idea that we should be afraid that this dynamic is going to lead to the next Columbine, the next Newtown. That's the concern I was trying to raise.
And Dave, let me nudge you on another piece of this. We're now in the kind of phase 2, after the story is broken, but before someone has written the 10-year book, and there's a lot that we still don't know. As you look back on the press coverage, not only the sort of the breaking coverage in which the trench coat mafia was gotten wrong and all that, but the first few months of coverage, what kinds of lessons do you think there are that can be usefully applied either to Sandy Hook or Boston to make the narrative that journalists are constructing now more productive, to serve news consumers and serve society in our need to understand or move forward in some sort of useful way? What do you think the journalistic lessons are?
Well, I think the simplest lesson is pretty simple, which is to avoid drawing conclusions. Mm-hmm. Now, we know that we're always going to get a lot of it wrong. And this week in Boston, we've seen that played out so many times already. Each day, like, oh, okay, throw out half the things we learned yesterday, and we've got a new set today. And that's always going to happen. I mean, we get things as details as they happen, and we try to, we report what we know, and then we figure out some are wrong. I draw the distinction between facts and conclusions. Mm-hmm. And facts have less of a staying power than conclusions. Because if I told you, or if I asked you right now, how many people think here that it was widely reported that 25 people had been killed at Columbine? Who thinks that? Okay, there were 15 killed. A day after Columbine, everybody in the country thought it was 25 because virtually every newspaper in the country ran with that headline because the goofball sheriff got it wrong before he had a figure. That didn't have staying power. Now, how many people here, and we've got an educated audience, so it might be different, but how many people think that Columbine was largely about, goths, loners, outcasts from the trenchcoat mafia who went on a spree to revenge jocks? How many people believe that? Okay, some of you read the book, and you're also, I'm setting you up. But when I do this at high schools, at all sorts of different audiences, like 90% of the hands go up. So most people still think that's true. That has staying power because narratives and explanations have staying power. Once we figure out, oh, I get what's going on here, we remember that forever. We remember 9/11 happened because of Osama bin Laden. Oklahoma City happened because of, what was going on with Tim McVeigh. Those kinds of things stay in our mind. Spurious facts, details, no. The fact that the perpetrator, the name was mistaken the first day, that was horrible for that kid. So that's a problem because it really sort of screwed up his life, although his life as the brother is going to be screwed up anyway. But in terms of long-term impact, no one's going to misremember it. That name is not. So those kinds of facts, they don't stay. And while I say, of course, try to get every fact right and try to get it as soon as possible, there's much less lasting danger for from the facts than when you start connecting them and drawing conclusions and putting a reason behind it too soon. And there's just one thing that's it. And sort of keep an open mind and keep like sort of all these things out on the table as possibilities. And you talked, when we get the journals out, do they have any estimate of when they're going to release those? Have they put any kind of date on that?
The report will be released in June, they say.
And the journals are going to come with that, do they say?
I don't know.
Yeah. Those tend to take a long time. I don't remember did we ever get everything from Joe? I mean, some he mailed to NBC, so we got it the next day. But did they ever release everything?
It wasn't all released.
I didn't
We
think
had
it
a big
was, yeah.
report by the Governor's Commission.
There was a lot
6 or 8,
redacted.
yeah.
Yeah. And with Columbine, it took more than 7 years. It was a court battle all the way to the Colorado State Supreme Court, 7+ years after that we got the journals. So it could be a long way now. Hopefully, I don't think that's going to happen here. But it can be a long time. And we were shocked when, I was shocked after I spent years on it and I'd done profiles and about Eric being, depressed and all these different things. When I actually got my hands on his journal and I got a couple of pages, and there's about 8 or 10 pages of, I don't know if you can see, of just full page hearts like this. I just could not believe my eyes. And nothing really prepared me for understanding how much love as well as anger was in that boy's heart until I saw page after page after this with, I love you on them, and some had like lots of little different hearts. And I really didn't get him. I won't ever fully get him, but I don't think I really got him completely until I saw this more than 7 years out. So you got to really be open to the evolving evidence. And at some point, we may hear more from their parents, and then we'll still understand and have to rewrite chapters of my book. But it's never a complete story.
Okay. Kevin, we're coming full circle. At the beginning of the day, before you got here, we had some reporters reflecting on the sort of first phase of coverage when the wounds of Newtown were really fresh. And for you and your neighbors and your city, these wounds are still super fresh and the information is still coming out. And yet you as a journalist have covered the long trajectory of suffering as well as the breaking news. Mm-hmm. You've been listening here as people have talked about some of the issues coming out. You're thinking about your column for tomorrow. You're thinking about what's happened over the last few days. Where do you see journalists in Boston focusing their efforts now, and what are you thinking about yourself and where this story needs to go for you?
I've spent the last week or so kind of focusing on victims and first responders, and I think there's a intersection between both of them. I think first responders are victims, and I think that I noticed just in my newsroom, particularly some of the younger reporters, they were very upset. God, I'm as old as dirt. I covered. I was in Omagh in Northern Ireland when 28 people and 2 unborn twins were killed by a bomb by the real IRA. And as I recall, it was the first time I ever cried on the job. I cried when I found these 2 women that they actually walked arm in arm down the street, and then they were killed in the blast. And I knew one of the RUC commanders at the time, and he told me their bodies were fused together. I started crying. It was the first time I ever cried on the job. But I remember the day after I went down to give blood, and I had to wait 5 hours. There were so many people there. But then I covered London. I was in London within like 8 hours of the bombing, and I had lived in London for 4 years and felt, it was one of my homes, and I cared about it deeply. And that was hard and all that. There were more than 50 people killed in the 7/7 bombings, and but this is completely different. And I think the difference for me professionally is that I knew so many of the first responders. They weren't my sources, they were my friends. The first night after, I wrote a really angry, not an angry, I don't know what the hell you call it. I just wrote a column about the first day, what it meant, how it went from a perfect day. It was so nice out. The Red Sox won with a walk-off. The race was going on, and everybody walked down to the race. And then I said the only thing missing was the Lou Reed song, perfect day. And then, by the way, you look like Lou Reed. Did anybody ever tell you that? But then it just, in an instant, it was gone. And then after I filed my column, I saw the film and I recognized some of the firefighters. I saw them. I could see Sean O'Brien, a friend of mine. I saw Sean diving over the barriers to get to people. And so I remember I'll go down the Erie pub because the firefighters who run always go there after marathon day. There'll be 30 firefighters there. So outside on the sidewalks, my buddy Joe Finn, he's the captain of Rescue 1, Deputy Chief Rescue 1. And I said, Joe, Jesus, I said, did you finish? He goes, no, I was like a half mile away. They stopped us. And then he started telling me, he was naming people that were caught up in the bomb and all that stuff. And I said, I thought I saw Sean on TV. He goes, oh, God. He goes, Sean, when he went, the first person he got to was little Martin, who was dead. And he knew he was dead. Sean told me later. He goes, I looked at him, I knew he was gone. But so Sean's looking at him, but he's not looking at him as a firefighter. Little Martin sat next to Sean's daughter, Ava, in school and was very kind to her. So it was, and we wanted to get Sean out, and he wouldn't come out. He just said just wanted to stay home. He didn't want to do anything that night. So the next night, it's funny because I was in that media scrum. It's, there's like MSNBC's here, CNN's here. They're all right next to each other, and all these people are coming in and out. And I forget who I did. I think it might have been Chris Jansing, or it might have even been Reverend Al, now that I think about it. And I just said, I got to go. They want me to stay. I go, no, I got to go. And I went to the firehouse. And on the way, I called Eddie Kelly, the head, who's in ladder 17, but he's also a union guy, and I knew he wouldn't get in trouble. So Eddie brings me in, and he said, we'll do this, but they don't want their names in the paper. And I said, well, I said, that's not a big deal. I don't need their names. He goes, yeah, but you're going to know them. I go, I won't know all of them. No, you're going to know all of them. And I did. I had one firefighter I didn't know. I'd never met him before. But it was really different. So I was going around, and like these guys were, one of them had been 3 combat tours, Iraq and Afghanistan. He's been on the job 6 years, Benny, very good firefighter, tough guy. And he was, he was just staring off into space. And I asked him, I said, I had known he had been treated for PTSD when he came back from his last tour. And I said, do you think you need it again? He goes, probably. And Sean was still in a tough place. Like I said, it was not, and everybody on Engine 7 had a connection to that family. The show, they call in firefighter parlance, you call the driver a chauffeur. So the chauffeur, Kevin Mead, his daughter babysat Martin. A lieutenant, his kid goes to school with Henry, the 9-year-old, the older boy who wasn't hurt. Eddie Kelly, who brought me up into the station, his daughter is in the same Irish step dance class as Janie, the daughter who lost her leg, and then Tommy Campbell, who had to pick her up and carry her off, knowing that her brother's dead, the mother's out. She had a head injury, and he picked up Janie, knowing she didn't have her leg. And I said, you can't make this up. It was also, it indicated that Boston is this small, big city where everybody, it was like I said, and then 2 days later, I'm walking down Newbury Street, and I see a woman, all the women officers from District 4, the police station, they were all at the finish line. And if you look at the video, you'll see they all ran to the crowd. They went right to the victims. And I saw this she's a young kid, she's in her 20s, and her older brother still plays hockey with us. And I saw her, and I just went across the street to her, and I just said, I want to tell you how proud, I know what you did. I'm so proud of you. And she broke down. I broke down. It was a mess. I mean, I didn't put that and stuff in the paper. In this, I mean, London was my home, but it's not like Boston. So this is struggling with this, and I'm not the only one that's struggling with it, because you try to do your job, but you're really like reliving everything with the particularly I have been with the first responders. And then Saturday night I hung out with all the cops, and 3 of them who were actually there, they took this kid out of Brendan Walsh, he took the kid right out of the boat. And Brendan you should see how big he is. I mean, he'd run through a wall for anybody. And I got some comfort, because Brendan was basically saying, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay. And I saw him, when he left the bar, he didn't even have a drink. He just sat there. I saw him stop and talk to a young EMT guy, a kid that's in the emergency medical services. And I saw, Brendan talk to him. He whispered something to him, because the kid was really having trouble. And then I talked to Eddie. I said, is that kid okay? He goes, he'll be okay. He's probably just as upset about the jumper. I go, what jumper? He says, we had a jumper today. So while but the guy didn't, while they're trying to get the bomber, the same guys and women who responded to the bombing scene were on the turnpike below, and there was a distraught guy threatening to jump off into the turnpike, and they talked him down, and they saved his life. And all the cameras from all over the world didn't record it, because they were all in Watertown waiting for the bomber. And I put it in my column, but I mean, it never would have seen the light of day if not for, that's what happens when you go to bar rooms, you find stories.
So part of your answer is going to be to keep that understanding of this as a community event, a community tragedy, and a community step forward, even as the politicians and the legal process and all that come into play. It sounds like that's where you're going to take
Exactly. I really think it was important for the community to know about these stories of incredible selflessness, and also to know what these people were going through on a real personal level, that they weren't just doing their job. These were the neighbors. The other thing I found just remarkable is that they didn't give their neighbors any special treatment. They responded to strangers the same way as they responded to their neighbors. And I thought that was really important. I thought the town was focused, locked and loaded. Okay. And everybody was very, very, and the funny thing is, I've said this in media appearances, the whole legal end of it, the whole, they're going to prosecute him. People don't really even care about that. That isn't what we're focused on. We got to bury our dead, we got to heal our wounded, and we got to take care of our first responders. Everybody else will take care of that idiot that they just charged. Yeah. I'm not even thinking about him, to be honest.
All right. Let's go to questions. Whether it's about Newtown or Boston, or this bigger question of where stories like this go from here. Anyone? A lot of rich stuff in the room here. Anybody? Or from online? Any of our live stream folks? Yeah, all right.
Hi, just a very quick question this time. Mike Paddock from the Republican American newspaper in Waterbury, Connecticut. I think this panel is extraordinary. There's so many different events that you are all connected to. Do you see one clear common thread in the way these stories have been told, and the way these stories have become essentially our history? Have they, one clear common thread that all of them in the way they were told?
I'd say it's goodness. That the forces of good or decency just embarrass the people that do the original atrocity or the trauma. Whoever inflicts the trauma at that moment has incredible power, whether it's at the end of a pointed gun or if it's at those clowns that put those bombs on Boylston Street. And then they look so puny and so pathetic when you see the forces that respond to that and respond so selflessly. And like I said, I've seen that everywhere. In all these stories, what Dave's talking about, what Jackie's talking about, Virginia Tech, and Oma and London, it repeats itself because you're just amazed and in awe of what ordinary people do in extraordinary circumstances. So that I talked with a very young 23-year-old kid, and I did a column about how her act of defiance, the way she could get back at the bombers in Boston was to move back into her apartment near the bombing site. And, a small gesture, but that's what she could do. She told me something really interesting. She says, I've already memorized the name of Martin Richard, Lindsay Lou, and Crystal Campbell. She says, this was before they caught them, they'll catch these guys eventually. She says, I will not remember their names in 5 years. I thought that was an extraordinary thing for her to say.
Anyone else on this, Stephen?
Yeah. I would agree. I think that each of these events that we're talking about, they do have common themes in terms of what it is to be a human being. And part of that is to suffer and to feel pain and loss, sadness. And we always use the terms, we were a mess, right?
I still am, Doc.
No. But you know what? Why wouldn't you be? And I think one of the reasons that sometimes at these worst of times we are at our best is when we actually realize, and why we were so compelled by your more recent version, is that, too often when the events are tiny or they're personal, what do we not do? We don't acknowledge it to ourselves. We don't acknowledge it to anybody else. Okay, so you said you were a mess, but guess what? Every one of us in the same situation would have been just like you. And what's so extraordinary about Boston and about every place that we've talked about is that people came together, and they came together and were able to be human together, suffer together, cry together, but by God, to also pull together and find strength in each other.
But then,
and to move forward.
But also, it changes your whole worldview. When everybody got up at Yankee Stadium last week and sang "Sweet Caroline," I'm like, there goes one of my shticks. I make fun of Yankees.
So here's the
I can't
deal.
make fun of Yankee fans anymore.
Here's the deal. Here's the deal that we've not mastered, although we have at times in our history where it's not just been one awful thing, but one awful thing after another. Think about the wars we've pulled through together on. Think about the social movements that have required us to come together, etc. But on the issues of violence and the multiple forms, whether it's the unusual mass killing or the daily occurrence of street violence in our neighborhoods or the domestic violence that happens across this country every day, we've not yet been able to fully mobilize all the things that we've been describing about what we share, and to not just sing Sweet Caroline at the Yankees game, but to continue and turn the corner and to apply and assert our joint combined strength to pay attention to where we can actually find solutions and interventions. I think that's also the direction for some of the writing I'd like to see.
I have a question maybe related to that, and then maybe there's other questions in the room. And this is a difficult one because it's about a divide on this panel, and a divide that's been in the room all day, which is about perpetrators and not only whether we speak their names or not, but whose story is this anyway? And Beth, I remember that, if I remember rightly, at Virginia Tech, there was an interesting moment when the Memorial of Stones was created, and someone added a 33rd stone. A stone.
It's sort of in the middle of the night, as I recall.
For Cho, and your paper wrote about that.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. I guess my question for all of you is, to what extent do the lives of perpetrators, accountability, where does accountability lie, and so on, how much does that figure into these stories? How important is it? Or is there a way that it's not? In ways Kevin was just saying, how do we how do we do this, where we focus on victims and yet how much do we talk about perpetrators? Anyone? Beth, maybe talk about how your paper kind of worked that out over time, because you've been had a while.
Yeah, I didn't personally work on these stories, but we tried to, who was this young man? And I'm curious, what's happened with his family. There hasn't been a lot of reporting done on that. He had a sister that I believe went to Yale, did very well. I was just thinking about that the other day as I was trying to prepare for today. And there's so many victims, we don't even know their stories yet. Yeah. And I was wondering, would those, when are those people going to be ready to talk, if they ever are? But I know you've done a lot more reporting on
the
perpetrators.
I want to ask Candice about this too, because Cure Violence, you work a lot with perpetrators, actually, right. And with victims as well. How do you understand that issue?
Well, we believe people can change, and they clearly should be held accountable for their behavior. But once someone has been released from the justice system, and I don't think we've worked with anybody who's been part of the mental health system and then come out. So I think we deal with we tend to deal with poor minorities, and they tend to go to the criminal justice system, not the mental health system. Even if they need mental health treatment, they tend not to get it. Certainly not in our correctional system. So we look at them returning to the community as people who have paid their debt to society and are ready to move on. And so, we're trying to, our target population tends to be between 16 and 25, people who've been involved in the criminal justice system, people who've been, committed acts of violence, people who are actively involved in a gang that's associated with violence, recent member of shootings. We have someone who's a weapons carrier. So if they're coming back and they're exhibiting, these kinds of criteria, then, we will work with them and try to help them to not cross the line that requires them to be part of the justice system again. Okay. So we do look at it as a behavior and something that can be changed.
I want to get a couple of questions in before we have to wrap. So.
Thank you all. I'm Judy Kuryansky. I've come to this discussion wearing two hats. One is a psychologist on faculty at Columbia Teachers College over there, and a journalist. And I've also been on both sides of the table, being interviewed about trauma and also being a first responder. On the 11th anniversary of 9/11, I wrote an op-ed for ABC News about how upset I was that there was so little coverage of people healing after this event. 11 years wasn't important. First year's important, 5 years, 10 years. So this is very relevant that all of you have addressed the coverage being helpful for people's healing. And so what do we do when the media light goes out and all these people still need to heal? How do we put the media light back on for all these intervals when people need ongoing healing?
Yeah, thanks, Judy. Dave, you've been on in Columbine for a long time. You say 14 years plus now. How do you think about that?
It's hard to do because they're so dispersed, and the longer it gets, the harder it is to even know. I get asked a lot, how are these people doing now? And it's easier to keep track of the families of the 13 dead because there are 13 of them, plus the 2 killers. The 2,000 students in the school, I hear from students all the time, but it's very anecdotal reports. It's self-selected, people who are writing to me, so that might be better. The best gauge we kind of had, and even when I talked to Frank DeAngelis, the principal, sometimes he's not really sure. The best gauge happened on the 10th anniversary. They had sort of a private ceremony for students coming back the day before, and they got something like 500 students came, I think, something like that. So about a quarter of the population who seemed to be doing really well, surprisingly well. Although, again, it's a self-selected, sample. So maybe the kids who were doing well showed up. But it's really hard to know when you've got a very diverse population. And with 9/11, if you've got thousands of people, who's going to track all those people down? So you can do anecdotal stories, obviously, but to try to get the full picture, it's almost impossible. That seems to me more like, I wish, like, it seems like a PhD thesis where you have a team of grad students who track them down or something. Seriously, and that's who I would think would do this kind of work and do the longitudinal studies, is maybe back to academia.
Stephen, but
just
keep it focused. If
you said shine the light, the media attention. I think when we're less afraid of the hurt and of recognizing that we can survive the hurt and build up again, then there'll be more focus on the healing. Okay. I think we turn away from the hurt, and we then don't follow up.
Let's do one more question, Fred.
Yeah, Fred Richin. You've been talking a lot about newspapers as a healing fabric for the community, and I'm not getting the same sense that radio or television or other kinds of media are as pivotal in a community in terms of healing. And many people are talking about the end of newspapers. They're all going digital or so on and so forth. So what's concerning me or interesting me is, as a mechanism, somehow the newspaper seems unique in today's panels as something that could continue to keep people linked, that has multiple voices. It's not talking at you, it's talking from within you, and so on and so forth. So I'm trying to sort of relate this to the future of journalism, the future of what you do, because it's simply not reporting, it's healing, it's understanding, it's something else going on. So do you have any comments on the uniqueness of newspaper versus other media, or is it just
I think it has more a function of that, particularly, I mean, Jackie could explain it more in her town, and Beth could talk about it when she was at Roanoke, that you're part of the community. You're not just coming in with a legion of assistants and people who put makeup on and attaching microphones. You live in the community, and people treat you differently, and you treat them differently. I always say I was never more accountable as a newspaper reporter than my first job at the late lamented Transcript Telegram of Holyoke. Because if I wrote something, I remember like the secretary for the licensing board running down the hall, "Why did you write that about me?" I had to deal with her. I couldn't just blow out of town. So
they're at you at the grocery store.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the difference. Now, you could say, well, what about local television and radio? I think then it comes down to resources, and they probably just don't have as many people. Like WBUR, we have a terrific public radio station in Boston, but I don't know how many reporters they have. They might have 5 or 6, I don't even know. But I think it does come down to resources. When that bomb went off in Boston, I think we had 60 or 70 reporters out on the street. Yeah. That's a big difference.
All right. I want to invite my co-conspirator, Emily, up here for any closing thoughts she may have. We've been on kind of a long journey today, and I promised live stream and C-SPAN that we would land the plane on time here. It's been a long kind of trip through the first response, through victim experiences, through social media, very important questions about digital innovation and its ethical impact, and through this kind of in-depth look on where we may be going forward. Thoughts, queries?
Thanks, Bruce. No, Joe. Well, first of all, thanks to everybody who took part, and particularly the panellists, because I think that somebody in the previous session said it's important to examine stories and their impact, and this picking apart of what we do as journalists and the impact it has on the communities that we cover is actually not something which we do automatically as a response to our work. And I think that that's something that I would take away from this, which is that to hear all perspectives and all sides of a story and to think about how we can make progress, both in terms of standards of reporting, how journalists feel about the stories, how communities feel about the stories, is very, very important. I think that we have a really sort of unfortunately, as Bruce has said various times, he's used the phrase several times today about the next tragedy, because we all know as journalists that there will be one. And I think that in that framework, we've heard several things today, particularly from people involved in perhaps parts of the stories that we don't always examine when we're covering them or discussing them. which particularly sort of appending to how we talk about issues like mental health, etc. I think it's very important that we produce standards around these issues, that journalists pay attention to them, but also that we realise, I think it was a member of this panel said, that we're also we're first responders as well. That we're both traumatised by these events, but also we have a responsibility in them. So I think it's great. It's a great day to have everybody here examining events at enough distance that we can get some perspective on them, but also close enough so that we actually can still feel why these stories are important to a range of people. And I thought it was a fascinating observation that 90% of people who you ask about the Trenchcoat Mafia sort of carry with them those first impressions of those wrong impressions that the media give. I think that here we're in a journalism school where we want our students to learn how best to tell stories, and we're living in an age where those stories don't now go away. There's a constant archive which is continually published, which revolves not just around the subject matter of the stories, but around the individuals who are involved as well. And so as this world unfolds, for us to carry on examining and learning from it, I think is a valuable thing to do. And as I say, they have great resources on the Dart Centre website for journalists to look at and to use. And hopefully today will provide us with more materials to compile that we can actively help people with, rather than just sort of discussing it and moving on. So thanks very much indeed, and thanks to Bruce as well, who's put this all together.
Well, all of us. One more thing, I guess where I would close this. In thinking about the events in December, in thinking about the events in Boston over the last week, in thinking about Columbine or shootings in Chicago or New Haven, thinking about Virginia Tech, in so many of these cases, I think there's the legal process that goes forward, and we spend a lot of our time as reporters in courtrooms reporting on the legal process, and that's news. But the truth is that for 26 children and teachers who have been killed in an instant, or for one child or one adult killed on the street in a neighborhood, or for any of these incidents, there's not really legal justice. There's not really justice for anyone losing a child. Yet, as journalists, we in this room do have the opportunity and the privilege, I think, of providing a kind of narrative justice. And all the journalists who are panelists here today have been talking in a profound way about using techniques of storytelling and interviewing, technology itself, in pursuit of the kind of narrative justice that both brings accountability to perpetrators, so at least the world understands who did what to whom and why, to the extent that it is possible to do so. That speaks as fully as possible about the lives of those who were lost, so the world can recognize who they are. And that looks forward as well to a kind of mission to make it less likely of an event like this happening again, even though there will always be tragedies. I think that pursuit of narrative justice is the common theme of the day, and is the kind of, it makes journalism itself a kind of answer to violence. And that, I think, is why we've been here today. Journalism itself is not just a first response in rushing to the scene, but it is a nonviolent answer in the face of unspeakable horror. Well, we speak it as journalists, and we try to tell stories. We did in Newtown, and will continue to do so going forward. People in this room will continue to do so. Kevin and others will continue to do so in Boston, as Beth and Dave did in Colorado and in Roanoke. So that's the deeper mission underlying this. Journalism itself is a kind of pushback against the horror. And I thank everybody today for being part of a conversation that illuminated that, but that also will, I think, help our colleagues do a better job and enrich the professional conversation about this going forward, which we do with recognition of what has been lost by so many people, and also the connections and communities that have been built up in response. Thank you all. Again, thanks to the Dart Center staff and the Tau Center staff and to C-SPAN and to Livestream and to everybody at this school who helped out. Let's call it a day. Thanks.